Welcome to the Omnibus Show, a program for people who are interested in everything, with deep conversations on a wide variety of subjects. And now your host, Dave Gibbs.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Omnibus Show, the program for people who are interested in everything, with deep conversations on a wide variety of subjects. Today's guest is Jay Franze, who is the host of the Jay Franze Show. Jay takes a deep dive into the entertainment industry to provide you with valuable insights and entertaining stories you won't find anywhere else. As well, he has Franze and Friends and the Ideas of Leadership podcasts. Jay has engineered projects for a host of legendary artists, including Jerry Lee Lewis, Hank Williams Jr., and Dolly Parton. And he's produced and engineered projects for indie artists such as Maddie McCree, Tristan Burke, and Allison Piccioni. In addition, he has engineered shows for such great guests as Phil Vassar, Keith Urban, and the Wilkinsons. He has also collaborated with top-notch producers like Bob Bullock and much more. He's worked in studios like The Tracking Room, Ocean Way, and Masterphonics. Welcome, Jay. It's good to have you here today.
Good to be here. Thank you
for coming up. On the way over here, I was listening to your latest episode with Carl Tatz.
Nice.
The award-winning studio engineer, and that was a very fascinating episode. I love listening to your episodes because I learned so much about the music and entertainment industry and people who've been on the inside. Well, to kind of get right into it, can you tell us about your milestones and what has led you up to now? And you've done a plethora of things.
There have been a few things, yes. It all started back in Boston when I was growing up. I wanted to work in music so bad. I wanted to be the front of a rock band, and I realized very quickly that I can't sing, so I transitioned into being a musician, and although my brain knew what it was supposed to do, my fingers just didn't want to do it.
Gotcha. So
I ended up wanting to still work in the industry, so what I did was I went to school so I could work behind the scenes. I'm basically the guy who pushes the big red button. So I went to school in Ohio at a small school. It was the only school at the time. It was the recording workshop. Mm-hmm. And when I was out there, I just spent all the time I could just soaking in all of the information and just trying to get to know the bands and trying to figure out what the next move outside of school would be. So I went back to Boston, and when I did, I wanted to work. I had a piece of paper in my hand saying I was an audio engineer. So there was two studios in Boston. There was one called Fleetwood and one called ESS. They were right across the street from each other. Mm-hmm. So I went to both of them saying, I want to work here. I want to be your engineer. And they said, we'll hire you as a freelance engineer. So I thought that was great until I realized what freelance meant. Mm-hmm. And it basically meant that I had to hustle my own work. But during the day, I was able to sit at Fleetwood and work with their head engineer and record books on tape. And then at night, I would go across the street and record the rock bands that I would hustle throughout the day. Mm-hmm. So I would try to get those bands, bring them into the studio and record their music for them. And then over time, I would write my own songs and then bring those into the studio and hire the musicians to come in and out. Until the day when the studio owner at ESS Productions told me, just passed him in the hallway and said, man, you're a very good producer. And I said, I'm a songwriter. He goes, no, you're a producer. And I didn't know what a producer meant because I was still young at the time. And he told me that being a producer, hiring all those musicians to come in and organize everything and putting the whole project together and then engineering it, he says, that's what a producer does. So from that point on, I wanted to be an engineer and a producer. And that's what I did. And that's what eventually led me to Nashville.
Amazing. Do you have a favorite project from your days in Boston?
From the days in Boston, well, I did get to work on a lot of my own, but I would say outside of my projects, I worked with two singers that were just amazing to me. One was called Max Weiner, a great singer. He was the lead singer for a band called Father Groove. It was amazing funk rock band. But I worked with him a lot on some solo stuff. And then there was another guy named Bob Vos, who was the singer of a band called Fortune, still to this day out of Boston. Mm-hmm. And I worked on some solo stuff with him as well. So those are probably my two favorite things that I've done.
Okay.
Out of Boston.
And then now you've moved on to Nashville.
I did, yes. New York first, but then to Nashville.
Oh, forgive me, New York. That's right. And then you went down to New York.
Yep. I went into New York and opened up my own studio from the ground up, had it built. So it was completely to my standards. It wasn't huge, but it was nice. It had a control room, had one large tracking room, and then had a room for photography and a room for graphic arts, and then your typical workshop and restrooms and stuff. It was nice.
So it's an all-in-one production.
All-in-one. We were doing everything. We were bringing in all the local rock bands. We would record them, then we would take their photos, and we'd do their website, and then we'd put everything out and ship them on the road. And it was fun. Got to do it. It was making a living, not a huge living, but it was making a living. And I really enjoyed it. But that's when I realized I wanted to take it even further, and that's what ended up leading me to Nashville. And that's how I ended up meeting Bob Bullock. So it was from that encounter that day in the studio in New York. I was sitting there at a table, just an eatery little section we had. And there was a Mix magazine and a Shania Twain CD on the table. And I was flipping through it, and I saw the ad for SAE, which is the Institute of Engineering in Nashville. So I said, I want to work there. I want to be a teacher there. And then I was opening the CD and reading the credits of Shania Twain, and I saw Bob Bullock's name. And I was like, I want to go work for Bob Bullock. So that was my mission, and people thought I was crazy. But the very next day, I hopped in my car and I drove to Nashville with those two things in mind.
That's amazing. To tie in, because we worked on a project before.
We did, yes, sir.
My first CD, which is like a hobby, love of music. I was working for a software company, and all this music was coming out of my mind, and I got all these musicians together. And back in the 2000s, you talked about Shania Twain. I went down and I met with the vice president, the gal who was overseeing the operations at Masterphonics.
Oh, yeah?
And Emerald. And she introduced me to Bob because he was working on a project. He was actually working probably on that CD for Shania. He was working with Shania Twain on that CD.
Yeah.
And that's how I got to work with you and Bob.
That's true.
And so that's how one thing led to another. So
it's crazy how things tie together.
It twins it together, yeah. And so it's great to see you again.
There you go.
But yeah, that was a fun project, and you guys did such a great job.
Yeah, Bob's amazing, absolutely amazing. Learned so much through the times working with him.
Yeah, he's such a veteran and a gentleman and great guy. And, all these different projects just for decades that he's worked on.
Yeah.
And it's amazing. But back to you. So you're down in Nashville.
Made it down to Nashville, and with those two things in mind, the very next day, like I said, I drove to Nashville. I made it to SAE. That was my first stop, the School of Audio Engineering. And I went in and I just asked the girl at the front desk, I said, who's in charge of education? She told me where to go. So I went to that office, and it turned out to be the instructor of the school I went to in Ohio.
Yes.
So that was fantastic. It was a great in. So I met him. He's like, oh, you visiting? What are you doing? And I told him I wanted to work there. And he said, well, you're not qualified. I said, well, what would make me qualified? He's like, you can be either a previous student who's proven themselves, or you can have so many projects within this community here. So I said, okay, and I did both. I signed up for the school, and I started to work for Bob Bullock. Now, going to work for Bob Bullock wasn't as easy as showing up at the school that day, because you don't just meet somebody like that in the street.
Correct.
But I was able to meet him through the school, and I was able to go to work with him. And I met with him because I brought him in as a speaker at the school. And he came in, and normally the students, at this time I was teaching at the school, and normally the students would set up the room. And for Bob, I set up the room.
Okay.
And because the students didn't want to do it. And he came in and he asked me who set up the room for him, because he said he liked the way it was done. And fabulous. I told him I did it. And he said, well, would you consider being my second? So I said, would I consider it? Sure. And then we went out, and after that, it was 3 or so years later.
That's fabulous. That is fabulous. And then you've worked on all those projects and the aforementioned people. You've worked with a lot of legends down in.
Yeah, that was actually, a lot of those were after Nashville. We talked briefly,
Yeah.
We've both had to take care of family members in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And I've gone through a lot. I was working in Boston, and through Bob, I met a guy named Carl Tatz, the big studio designer, one we mentioned. And Carl had designed a room for me in my house in Nashville. So I was able to mix records in Nashville and out of my home, something that was just new at that time. And then my mother got sick. So I had to go home to take care of my mother, and that was in Boston. And the only way I could continue working is to move that studio that I had in Nashville to Boston. So I did. And when I did, I was working for a producer out of Los Angeles who came across all these tapes, thousands of tapes, old recordings of Dolly Parton, Hank Williams Jr., Johnny Cash, and so on. Jerry Lee Lewis was one of my favorites. And he asked me if I would go ahead and clean them up and remaster them all. So that's what I did. And I spent my time in Boston, although I did record Allison Piccioni, like you mentioned, and a few others from that time, which was an amazing project as well. But I got to have continuous work by working on those thousands of tapes. And that's what got me through that time before I was able to move back to Nashville.
You're like those Abbey Road guys that have been like, for the past decade or so, they've been remixing and mastering all the old records.
This was amazing. I mean, the story behind those tapes is just amazing within itself. So it was a good time. Those tapes were found. The producer that hired me to remaster those tapes, he heard a rumor that those tapes were in a barn in Pennsylvania. And he tried tracking them down for years and finally found somebody who can confirm the rumor, got him to the proper barn, and it took maybe 2 or 3 years of communicating back and forth with people who own the barn to convince them to sell him the tapes.
Wow.
Finally, they sold him the tapes. He didn't know if the tapes were even any good or if they would play because they were in that barn for 30 plus years.
Yeah.
Just between heat and cold and heat
Right,
and cold.
heat and cold. And that's up north, so you're going to have all the varieties of weather in that environment.
Yeah. So I was able to take those tapes, and I bought a reel-to-reel tape machine, transferred them all into the digital domain, and worked on them and found what was good, what wasn't, was able to clean up what was possible, and we went ahead and put it together.
That's amazing. So you had a lot of recordings. Now, did that go back to press to vinyl for those remaster, or did you just go digital recording?
I delivered the digital final product.
Okay.
That went to the producer in Los Angeles. What they do from there, I don't know.
Gotcha, because that's a fascinating process.
I know they were talking to the Country Music Hall of Fame for a little while because I went to a couple of those meetings with them. They were actually talking about putting it as a display at the museum. I don't know if it ever happened, but that's what they were talking about.
Fascinating. My late father had a cousin named Doc Martin, who was a slide, not the guitar player. He was a slide guitar player. He played a Fender. He was with Red Foley's band, and back in the 50s and 60s, he was in a what's the show down in Springfield, Missouri, which is the area my dad was from. It was called the Ozark Jubilee, which a lot of younger people have no idea what that is, but in their day, I mean, the last conversation I had with him, he was telling me about all the country and early country pop singers of that time that he recorded with live on the show. They were the band. Yeah. So, it was just amazing. And he sent me some recordings. But going back, he played in, so I have a little bit of country. And I've been to that museum. It's a beautiful museum. And they've really, really documented just an amazing amount of material there.
Insane.
It's fabulous. Well, we're going to take a break right now, and we'll be back with Chapter 2 in just a moment. Well, welcome back. We're here with Jay Franze from Chapter 2 of the Omnibus Show episode. Now, Jay, you were telling us about your personal story, which is it's a great and wonderful journey that you've taken in the world and life of music. And to kind of pick up on that and to kind of pique the interest of those who are interested in recording process and in becoming a recording engineer and going through everything with engineering and mixing and mastering. Do you have a really good, fun story that you could tell us about in the recording process that from an engineer's perspective?
There's all sorts of stories. Working in Nashville, I've had a chance to work with any and everybody you could think of when it comes to country music. And some of the big ones that stand out to me is I remember pranks in the studio where musicians would play pranks on each other, whether it be anything from as simple as unplugging a piece of their equipment during a big moment, or whether it be, trying to convince somebody that we were recording something that was just completely out of the realm of what we would normally do.
Yeah.
It's just the crazy antics that happened there. But one of the ones that stick out to me the most was working in a project with a big producer, and it was coming to an end where they were getting ready to pop a bottle of champagne, and they were messing with the new intern that was there because they wanted champagne flutes. And so they asked the intern's looking all over, can't find him, comes back with, glasses or paper cups or whatever they had. And they got really upset and said, absolutely not, we're not doing this. So the intern gets in a car and drives to Walmart or wherever they're going, and finally comes back hours later with glasses, and the bottle's gone and done. And they were just messing with them. And when it started, I didn't realize. I just thought, wow, that's not very nice. But it turned out that they were just messing with the person. It was their way of welcoming that person into the studio.
So they really are a fraternity, right?
It is like a fraternity in a lot of ways, in Nashville specifically. In Boston, it was different because Boston's different than Nashville, where Nashville's like a corporation. You would show up in the morning and you would work in 3-hour blocks as part of a union.
Yes.
So it was pretty much from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. In Boston, we didn't even go into the studio until 10 p.m. And then you would work all night long. So when we would do that, there was all sorts of crazy stuff that would happen in those studios.
Sure.
And some are great stories where we'd bring in musicians and they don't know what they're doing, they don't know where they're going, and people would play pranks on them as well. So
sure.
I mean, there's all sorts of crazy things we probably can't talk about, but there's also the fun ones where just people get out of their realm of comfort.
Yeah.
And you just push it and push it and push it. And by the time it's over, then they're very relaxed. And when they're very relaxed, you can get a good recording out of it.
That's where you get a better recording.
Yeah.
Now, I know there are going to be lots of artists, but do you have a particular, for yourself, favorite experience of working with a particular artist in the studio and that process?
I have two that stand out to me right out of the bat. One I produced, and one I was lucky enough to work with Bob Bullock as an engineer. And that one with Bob Bullock was Travis Tritt.
Mm-hmm.
So we went into Emerald Studios, which is, the building is still there, but it's no longer Emerald Studios in Nashville. It's right on Music Row. But I went in the night before to set up and make sure everything was good for that morning. And my job at the time was setting up and getting everything ready for Bob when he would come in. And that meant I work around the clock. And around 6 a.m., I would say, Travis walks into the building. And I had met him once or twice before at Sony Records, years before this.
Mm-hmm.
And he walked in and remembered me and recognized me and came up by name, said, "Hey, Jay, I didn't realize you were working on this project." And I was like, "Oh, hey, yeah, no, absolutely, here to help." He goes, "Is there a place I can go that's quiet where I can write the song?" And I asked him, I said, "What do you mean write the song?" He goes, I said, "What song are you talking about?" He goes, "The one we're going to record today." I'm like, "You haven't written the song yet?" He's like, "No." He goes, it won't be that bad. I'm like, okay. So he went into a room off to the side. The rest of the musicians start coming in. And as soon as all the musicians start coming in, Travis hears them and comes out. And it was Chris Lusinger was the lead guitar player and session leader of that session. He's a great guitar player. He's on the road right now with Garth Brooks. An amazing guy, an amazing talent. And Travis walks up, puts his leg up on a chair and puts the guitar down and says to Chris, he goes, "This is what I've come up with." And he just starts playing. And Chris picks up a piece of paper and just starts writing it down. As soon as he's done playing, Chris hands me the piece of paper and says, "Can you make copies of this?" It's like, okay. I run, make copies, hand them out to the musicians. They go into the room. And 3.5 minutes later, that song is done with the exception of Travis singing the vocals. So, I mean, the musicians were done. So I set up all night long, all morning. Wow. And they were done in 3.5 minutes.
That's amazing.
So that was an amazing story for me, amazing time.
That's amazing. The shortest thing I've ever heard on musicians is that the producer from the movie Hard Day's Night asked John Lennon to write a song. I guess they came up with a title. And he said, "We need another song. Write the song for the title, right?"
Write it now.
And he went home and he like did it, and then he went to the studio, however many days that would take. But it was like pretty much overnight because they needed it like the next day or something like that. But they had to record it and then they get it off to the movie people. But this is even more so. I mean, this is like write it there when you're recording. So that's amazing.
Another funny story, if you don't mind me going on a little bit of a tangent.
I don't mind.
I wrote a song for Saturday Night Live, and it was for a bit with John and Paul from the Beatles. And they were sitting at a big white piano, sitting on the bench next to each other, and it appears as if they're writing a song together. So in the song they're writing was my song. So they're writing this song.
That's great.
And my song's playing as they're pretending to play on the piano. And the whole thing is a skit about them writing the song, and it turns out they weren't actually writing a song. They were actually talking about opening up a fried chicken joint. And I'm like, well, that's not what my song was intended for. But it was funny.
They gave it a twist.
It was a great opportunity to have a song in a TV show like that and in a skit like that.
That's fun.
I mean, I'll take it.
Yeah, with Saturday Night Live, that's like getting into the Smithsonian for the history. Now, moving along with towards the engineering process, would you have any fraternal or dad-like advice for a young engineer who wants to get into the business today? And what kind of track, because there's different people with different kind of musical interests, but someone who wants to get into a studio, whether it's Boston or New York or Nashville or LA, what would be some healthy advice for someone on that pathway?
Outside of don't do it. I think the biggest thing, it's one of those careers that, like anything else, you could probably learn it on your own. But if you do, it's going to take an extreme amount of time.
Sure.
Especially as technology advances, there's so many more pieces of technology that you have to understand, you have to know how to use. So the quicker you can expedite that by maybe going to take a program at a school, highly recommended if you can pick the right school, get in with the right professors that can walk you through a good, solid program.
Right.
Because during that time, not only will you learn how to use the gear, but you're going to network. And if you do that in a school that's located in, say, Nashville or New York or Los Angeles, one of the hubs, even Georgia, where if you're in one of those hubs where music's being created, not only are you learning how to use the equipment, but you're networking with people within that industry, and you can intern with people in that area, which then means you can eventually start shadowing people and learning. But the other thing I would say is if you do choose a school, or even if you don't choose a school, find somebody that you can shadow as quickly as possible. Even if you're in school, don't worry if you don't know anything yet. Just go out and find somebody to just sit in the room. Because like I said, I went to school in Ohio, went back to Boston, went to New York, and I had my own studio, and I thought I was doing great. But as soon as I got connected with Bob in Nashville and had a chance to shadow him and work for him for years, I realized I didn't know as much as I thought I did. And I learned more in a week of working with Bob than I did in years of going to school. So I think it's that balance of the two, having The education enough to know what buttons to push and when.
Gotcha.
And then working with somebody that you can understand it's not just about pushing the buttons. It's about the speed. It's about learning that the producers are coming in and spending an extreme amount of money with an artist to record. You got to pay for the recording studio. You got to pay for each and every musician. You got to. There's just so many different things you got to pay for. And if you add it all up, and this was a lesson I learned with Bob, if you add it all up really quickly, you realize they're spending thousands of dollars an hour. So for every moment you take that you're not conscious of speed, you're spending somebody else's money.
Right.
So in Nashville specifically, when they're 3-hour blocks and on union scale, you better move fast.
You got to get her done.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's excellent advice. Having started out in communications with journalism and photography, there's some parallel, but that's great advice, especially when you're starting out and shadowing. Shadowing is
It's key.
yeah,
for sure.
it really is. It helped me. Now, moving on to your podcasts.
Yes, sir.
You've had 3. Can you give us a quick rundown? We introed on them, but could you give us a quick rundown on them? And we'll put links to his website and his podcasts in the description.
You mentioned 3. So let me tell you the way I look at it and the way that I talk to my wife. This is very important because I know she'll be watching this, so please understand. I have 3. It's one concept. I just talk to people. I interview people. And then it's what bucket do those interviews fall into? So it's the same show, just distributed into 3 different buckets.
Sure.
So the main flagship show is the Jay Franze Show, where I talk to people in the entertainment industry, where we get behind-the-scenes stories of how things got done.
Yeah.
So we just had Teresa Strasser on last Tuesday, I think it was, and we stream live, so it's puts a little bit of extra pressure on the guest to help give us good quality stuff. And she came on the show. She was known for being the host of a TLC TV show called While You Were Out, which is one of those home decorating type shows where they go in and they're under pressure to put a living room or something together on a $1,500 budget in 2 days. So we get to learn and hear about those type of pressures, whether it's real or whether it's not, how much pressure was put on those people. And we talked to a lot of musicians and learned about how their albums came together.
Yeah.
We talked to people who had record deals that, were probably not good for the artist. And we learned what was good and what wasn't good. We had one artist.
And that's good for musicians.
It is great, yeah. When people can come on and see that the holy grail that everybody thinks you have to have a record deal, and you realize that a lot of times you're better off without it. And there's artists. I had Billy Yates on recently. He's a country artist. He's traveled all over the world. He's had 18 number 1 hits. He's written for George Strait and all these other people. And he had a record deal with Sony Records, and he asked them to release him. He didn't want to be part of the organization anymore because he thought he could do better on his own, because he would put 100% of his attention into his career, where the label had to split that attention with all of the other artists.
Gotcha.
So it wasn't that they weren't doing a good job and didn't like him or anything. It's that divide in attention. He didn't want the divide. So, for example, like when he would go out to do radio spots, he would travel around the country and do all these radio spots. If the record label felt it was more advantageous for them to have a different artist take the spot, at the last minute they'd pull him and put somebody else in. And he felt he would have a better chance on his career if he would set everything up. And he did. He hired a team of people, he set it up, and he ended up becoming a very big star overseas. As an artist, he was more successful overseas. He had, like I said, 18 number 1 hits and so forth. But in the States, he was known more for being a songwriter. He wrote several songs for George Strait, Kenny Chesney, and a handful of other people.
Wow. That's quite a schedule of people.
Yeah, so that's the flagship show in the bucket. But if any of those people from that show have a lesson they could teach in, say, artist development or leadership, we then have them come back and do another episode, and that interview just gets dropped into either an artist development bucket or a leadership bucket.
Leadership, yeah.
So those are, to me, I consider them to be segments of the original show.
Sure. That is That's a nice little breakdown, and it's nice that you have those options for people to follow. And as I said, I was listening to Carl's show on the way over here, and when we were talking before, I was listening to Charles Dye's programming.
Oh yeah, two great guys
on Pro Tools, because we had used that. You know, in your conversation, you reminded me when I went. I won't mention her name, but I met a singer from L.A. The time I met Bob. And she was telling me she had sung backup for some very famous names, and she was a very well-known local person in LA, but she got signed to a label. And the problem is that the label had put her on the shelf.
Yeah.
So basically, per your advice, that's not always a good thing to get signed. They put her on the shelf, and she basically got frozen out because they had another voice that was popular at the time who they wanted to promote. So it's kind of like buying out the competition and narrowing the market. And so that's good advice to know about.
That has happened in the past. I've heard stories where if you have two female artists or two male artists that are very similar, and they're competing, what will happen a lot of times is the label will buy the record deal of the other person and shelf it and say, we'll get back to it. And they keep promoting the one that they have the vested interest in.
Yeah.
And then most of the time, they don't ever get back to promoting the other person.
Sure. That's a sad thing.
It's a business.
Yeah, I understand. And that's good for creative people to understand.
Right. Because
a lot of times creatives don't understand business, and that can do them in.
Yeah.
And also have a lawyer. But, well, moving towards conclusion, and it's been great having you on the show. Can you tell us about what's coming up, any recording projects you want to talk about, and what you'd like to talk about, anything coming up on your show that will let our guests know so they can follow up?
Sure. No, my biggest thing in the recording world at the moment is I still to this day work with a production company out of Nashville, and I do all of their recordings that they do for their artists. Mm-hmm. They either do artist development deals, which is where I really strive, working with independent artists who are trying to make that next level. So I can go ahead and record their project at a level that would compete with the majors if they are so lucky enough to get chosen.
Gotcha.
But I work with this production company that also has a publishing arm, so they write songs and hopefully get them sold for TV shows, movies, or the holy grail for them is having another artist cut it.
That's where you make your money.
That's where they make the most money.
Yeah.
And then as far as the show goes, that's fantastic. I've got a guy named Mark Rubel coming on the show tonight. He's amazing. He's played in rock bands and stuff out of Chicago. In his early days, he's been a producer and engineer for all sorts of major artists. And he's currently now working at Blackbird Academy as their director of education. Mm-hmm. So I'm very excited to talk to him tonight. That will stream live. We do stream live every Monday at 10 p.m. Eastern, and it streams to my YouTube channel, which is just Jay Franze. You can also just find it on the website. Mm-hmm. But we'll stream live, and then what we do is we edit the recording after the fact, and we release the audio typically 1 week later.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you, Jay. I hope that our audience will go to your website and to your podcasts and hear some more great stories. So look forward to your upcoming shows. Well, thank you. And if you do choose to go by the website, just say hello. Just let me know you're there. Say hello. Well, thank you, Jay. It's great having you on the show today. I appreciate it. I love being here. Well, we've had Jay Franze, our guest today on the Omnibus Show. We'd like to thank our sponsor, Hotel Carmichael. We're shooting today at Feinstein's. We look forward to our next episode with you on the Omnibus Show. If you enjoyed this program, please like, share, and subscribe to continue the conversation. For the Omnibus Show newsletter, please sign up at theomnibusshow.com.